here's what Paul begins addressing in verses 17 to 21. If God does all of this for us, okay, if he justifies us fully and finally, and we therefore don't have to worry about God ever judging us, we don't have to ever worry about a verdict coming in at the end of our lives saying rejected or failure. If that's true, won't that make people live selfishly and irresponsibly? Well, that's what the religious teachers in Paul's day, and quite frankly in ours, were afraid of. That's what they were afraid of. They didn't like all this grace talk because they thought people would get lazy and out of control. You got to temper this stuff, Paul. You got to remind them that there are certain things they have to do in order to ensure that God will continue liking them and loving them. You don't talk about this, the unconditionality of God's love and that what God has done for them gets them in forever, because then what will be the impetus for them to live rightly? Well, the underlying fear there is that grace leads to immorality and loose living. And sometimes it does. I hear this all the time from people. They're like, yeah, but if you talk about grace too much, people will take advantage of it. I'm like, take advantage of it. We've been taking advantage of it every single minute of every single day of our entire lives. I mean, if God's grace toward us is not dependent on whether or not we take advantage of it. You see, sometimes people, and I've met a lot of people who grew up in sort of stricter religious circles specifically, and they've believed their whole life that they need to be good so that God will love them and accept them. And then they hear this, and they kind of go off the rails for a bit. Understandably so. It's like someone who's felt trapped for so long that once they get free, they go a little nuts. Expect that. I mean, that's part of the process of this truth getting deep into our hearts. Now, let me warn you, if you choose to live that way, you won't have to deal with condemnation from God. Okay, that's been settled. There is therefore now no condemnation. That's settled. But you will have to deal with whatever consequences come from your decisions. A couple examples. I mean, you can talk bad about your boss without sacrificing an ounce of God's acceptance, because God's acceptance of you is not based on how you talk about your boss. But you might lose your job. I mean, you can cheat on your spouse without losing one bit of God's love, because God's love for you is not based on fidelity to your spouse. But you'll probably lose your marriage and ruin your family. So you're free. Hear this. This sounds controversial, but it's not. You're free to sin without losing God's favor, but you're not free from the horizontal consequences of it. Okay? Now, having said that, it's very telling to me that the people who have the hardest time with the message of grace have always been religious people. Always. And the reason they've had the hardest time with it is because sin prevention and controlling how people behave is the goal of religion. I've said this before, but we tend to think that religion is all about God. But actually, it's not. Religion's all about me. It's what I need to do, who I need to become in order for God to welcome me, in order for God to love me, in order for God to accept me. It's religion in that sense is very narcissistic. It's all about me and what I do, and not about God and what He's done. So they use, because sin prevention and controlling how people behave is the goal of religion, they use guilt and fear tactics to get people to be good, to fly straight. You gotta, yes, talk about grace, but you gotta get them to believe in some subtle or maybe not so subtle way that if they continue doing this, or if they don't get it right, if they don't make things better, that there's a good chance that God's gonna be like, you know what, I made a big mistake in justifying you. I am now unjustifying you. Throughout history, The greatest attacks on grace have always come from inside the church. Always. Now, interestingly, the greatest attacks on morality have typically come from outside the church, but the greatest attacks on grace have always come from inside the church, inside the religious community. Always. Jesus dealt with it, Paul dealt with it, Luther dealt with it, and throughout history, people have been dealing with it. Because somewhere along the way, we've come to believe that this whole thing is about personal moral improvement, and grace just doesn't possess the teeth to scare us into behaving well. So let's temper it. Let's mix it with some fear and guilt. Let's mix it with some conditionality. But the biggest thing that religion misses when it comes to grace is that grace is the only thing that can actually change a heart. It's the only thing. All of the confusing language I read earlier in verses 17 to 21, it simply means this. Okay, this is the summary of that section is simply this. The law, keeping the rules, may have the power to modify our behavior temporarily, but it does not have the power to change a heart, and the heart is always what God is after.